So thank you everybody for coming. I must admit it's been a little while since I did some public speaking like this. Usually, actually I was told that maybe I should start with a poll here, but I have to say that whenever you ask people to do a poll in cybersecurity, you could ask them, have you ever stolen anything? And I think half of us would put our hand up. You ask anybody if they've had a cybersecurity breach. Right. So essentially, the idea of today is I want to kind of take you through, a lot of this stuff will be quite familiar, obviously working within the hospitality space. And so I just wanted to kind of go through some of the stuff that we've been seeing ourselves over the last 12 months with our customers and talk about some of the things that have been happening in terms of cybersecurity threats and how you might go about mitigating some of those. So a quick introduction of myself. So previous to actually starting ThreatSpike, which has been going now for around about 13 years. I actually used to be a consultant at Accenture and Deloitte, and so working within those companies, I was advising some of the largest companies in the world, primarily around financial services, on how to actually secure their networks and identify people, for example, stealing information, them getting hacked and things like this. And one of the things that stood out to me was how badly these companies were doing it, even when they had millions of pounds to spend. And it wasn't really per se their fault. I think a lot of it came down to vendors. Within the cybersecurity space, everybody's kind of like cutting up cybersecurity. It's kind of like buying a car in parts. And ultimately, nobody's coming along and kind of really trying to take the problem away. And this is kind of what led to the idea of ThreatSpike. And so essentially, ThreatSpike, the idea of ThreatSpike is that we offer a single service to help our customers with security in general. We've developed our own in-house security platform where we deliver through that all the different types of security controls that a company might need to defend itself. So for example, instead of buying EDR and email security and data loss prevention and things like this from different separate vendors, we actually provide it as one strategic platform where we can implement any type of security control. And then we do it on a subscription service so that companies can sign up and they can just use as many of the controls as they need, and we work with them over time to improve their security. Now, the really nice thing about that is that when cost is not a factor, you do find that actually companies will implement a lot of security. They obviously want to, and a lot of time it's the budgets which are holding them back. And so today, we are now in a position where we are actually covering around about 80 countries in terms of our monitoring. So we have an endpoint agent which sits on end-user machines. And so from that, we'll be monitoring things about the device, we'll be monitoring what's happening on it, we'll be monitoring where it is. And so here is kind of a representation of all the different places that we're monitoring at the moment. And so on an average day, interestingly, when I was actually working through Deloitte with investment banks at the time, 1 billion events a week was actually a lot of data. And so we're actually processing somewhere in the region of 30 billion events every single day. And so we get a lot of visibility into actually what's happening out there. And so we can collectively use that to understand the different types of security threats that different industries are facing. So what has hospitality faced this last year? Well, the short answer to that is a lot. Hospitality is actually, at the moment, the highest targeted industry out there. So that wouldn't have always been the case, but definitely over the last couple of years, it's interesting that we've actually seen threats first affecting hospitality clients, and then actually within about, say, a few months, you'll then see them rippling into other industries. And so I think a really good example of this actually was last year, as part of our security platform, we created email protection and rolled that into our service offering. And the first customer that we rolled it into was a retailer, and they were processing somewhere in the region of 3 million emails per month. And that kind of gave us a really good understanding of the problem set. And then we started onboarding hotels. And I have to say, it was just so totally different. The number of phishing attacks that the hotels are facing is just another level. If I were to tell you that some of the hotel groups that we actually provide email protection for, we're quarantining 35% of their emails every day. This is a lot. And so if you think about a single phishing email can obviously cause a mailbox breach, it can result in malware, it can result in ransomware even. This is a huge threat. And so what I wanted to kind of talk about was, and again, I mentioned, a lot of you will be familiar with these types of threats. Maybe not all of them, but actually everything I'm going to talk about here was actually from the last year. So I would say that around about mid-year last year was when things started getting pretty bad within hospitality. Started to see a lot of info stealers. So info stealers are actually a type of malware where you will receive it. And so if we take this example here, so this is an actual, all the things I'm going to use here are actually genuinely, these are samples which are actually being taken from monitoring. And so here, this is actually an email which was sent to a hotel. And what you've got in here is somebody who's pretending to be 68 years old. They're saying that they're having difficulty navigating to the hotel, and they're then requesting that the hotel go and download this zip file and then open it. And they make specific reasons as to why you can't do this on a phone and things like this. They're very prescriptive about how you should open this file. And when you download this file, inside of it is a type of malware which is an info stealer. And so info stealers are designed not to persist on the system. So they are designed to just literally just run once. They just gather all the information from the system. So your cookies, your history, your passwords, your VPN tokens. They will take a picture of the screen. And if they can, they'll also try to take some files from the downloads folder and things like this. And as we all know, the hotels tend to have thousands of files sitting in the downloads folders. So even this is an information leak at this point. But the thing is that with info stealers, that's it. They just then disappear. And so when you come to do the forensics, there's nothing. It's deleted itself. It's all gone. And actually, these were incredibly successful against some of the top EDR solutions in the world. And so a lot of people didn't realize that it was actually happening. And so when these then ran, what the attackers were then able to do is they were able to then go and log into systems using these credentials. Now, a really interesting thing, and we all talk about AI a lot, but really interesting is I actually ran this through a tool online. So you can actually, it's at 0GPT, in case you're interested. You can actually take text and you can run it through there, and it will highlight the bits which it thinks have actually been created by something like a ChatGPT. And so when we run this email actually through this analyzer, it highlights that this middle paragraph here is actually likely AI generated. And so this is the kind of, you're starting to see the entry of AI into these different types of phishing. It's no longer something which is just vendors scaring you. It's actually genuine threats, and this allows them to very carefully craft lots of different types of emails and not sit on any one particular template, because the thing is that as soon as a security vendor picks this up, then they'll take this, they'll add a signature for it, and then they'll roll it out, and that's it. And so what they're doing is actually using these AI tools to generate different narratives, different reasons why the targeted user should actually go and download the file. And so once they click on the download link, typically this would actually take them to a well-known file storage system. So in this case, for example, this is Google Drive. They specifically actually tell Google Drive not to run the antivirus, so you can just pass it in as a parameter. And then when you download it, then within that zip file, there's an SCR file, which is a screensaver executable. And at that point, it executes, it does its job, collects the information, and sends it out. And so, as I mentioned, when this InfoStealer malware actually runs, it will retrieve the configuration files, the passwords, the session cookies, and things like this from the system. And so then, with this information, the attacker can then log on to booking systems, it can log on to pretty much any kind of SaaS application, and they can connect to the VPN. I'd say the VPN is the most dangerous because, obviously, if you haven't secured the VPN using multi-factor, then they will just get onto your internal VPN, and then ransomware would be the next logical step for them. Once the InfoStealer malware completes, it just deletes itself. So in addition to this, we started to see lots of different evolutions, actually, of InfoStealer malware. So this one was a zip file with an executable, and I would say around about September time last year, actually November is this particular example here, is this is something, again, which was very new. So this is fileless info stealers. This is where somebody would download a shortcut file within Windows. So it's not an actual executable itself. And when they double-click the shortcut, Windows will automatically connect out, typically to a Russian IP address, using the SMB protocol. It would pull in the executable, and then it would make it appear as though they're just the users just looking at it in their local Explorer, and then the user would just run it. And the nice thing about this is that it literally never sits on the actual system. It's always just kind of mounted over the network. And so this was a really good example of something which we saw within hospitality. And then I think within about a month, we were then seeing it used in different industries. So that's on the info stealer side. Then, again, this is all over the last year. After the info stealer wave, we then started to get into the whole Teams phishing. So this was where companies had not actually prevented external users from interacting directly with their internal staff. So they could just come along and they could initiate a Teams conversation with internal staff, and they would pretend to typically be the CEO, and they would present a file and say, look, this is, for example, this is your new paycheck, or this is your bonus, or something like this. And then obviously, then at this point, the user would then be intrigued and open it up. Now, the really good thing from this perspective for an attacker is the fact that it hasn't gone through the email security solution. So if you think about your different layers of security, which parts of your stack are actually designed to stop phishing? Because certainly your email protection stops phishing, but then which other part of your solution? And one question I like to pose to people is, do they think their EDR solution detects phishing? And so if you don't know the answers to these questions, then this presents a very big potential gap within your network. And so you've obviously got booking systems, and the phishing links and phishing messages might come through those booking systems. You might have online chat systems, and people might interact directly on your website. And so again, all these different mechanisms can be used to phish your staff, and you might not have any potential protection against this. And so here we have an example of an info stealer malware that was actually shared through one of these Teams conversations. Now, this was actually very easy to stop, because what essentially all you had to do is just stop external users from interacting with your users and just keep Teams localized for your internal network. Which then brought us to the phishing.com issues. So booking.com phishing. So initially with the info stealers, one of the key things that they targeted was actually booking.com. And then all of a sudden, it changed overnight into actual booking.com phishing. So where users were starting to receive phishing emails, which would then entice the person who's working on reception to actually then click onto a link or a picture, and at this point, they would then actually go to a fake booking.com website. And so at this point, so we can see here, for example, the messages were they were quite, initially here, we're seeing an interaction, for example, with the hotel manager. They say they'd like to book a double room, they specify some dates, and that's it. The actual email itself doesn't do anything at all. This is one of the first examples, I think, of a multi-stage phishing. So this is the kind of thing that you would see penetration testers do, but this isn't the kind of things that you would typically see phishing emails do. Usually phishing emails are quite succinct. Click on a link, provide some details. But in this case, they actually waited for a reply to come back. And so hotels were just replying to these emails because they are benign. And as soon as they replied back, they then got the next stage of the phish. And so here, we can actually see where the hotel has replied, and then we can then actually see the response that's come back. And this is fully automated. So it says, hello, I have booked a room, but my card has not been charged. And they provided a screenshot, which is supposed to be booking.com. And so if you click on this, it then takes you to the fake booking.com website. And so there were a lot of different variations of the booking.com phishes. We saw that one example there. We've then got other examples here. You can see that the format is quite readily changing between these. And so again, we see fake links, which when you actually click on them are taking you to other spoof booking.com websites. We then also got various other types of ones, which again, they take on similar but slightly different types. And so we've got one on the left-hand side which talks about sustainable living, so people expressing interest in how sustainable a hotel's practices are. And so what is quite interesting about this is that these attacks, they were still quite dumb at the end of the day, because let's say, for example, that they emailed and they got an out-of-office message, then they would actually automatically reply to the out-of-office message with the phish. So it wasn't a particularly sophisticated process, but it was interesting to see that it was actually a multi-stage attack. And I think one of the most enlightening things about the Booking.com phishing was the fact that people took to LinkedIn to say that Booking.com had been phished. If you look at all the news stories, there was so much confusion as to how this was happening. And a lot of people were actually saying that it was Booking.com that got hacked, and this is how then guests were then getting phished. But actually what people didn't realize is that it wasn't really Booking.com that got hacked, it was actually their hotels that got hacked. And again, using info stealer malware, these types of phishes, their staff were actually giving access to Booking.com and as the hotel, but they weren't even aware of it. And so that kind of demonstrates that there's quite a severe lack of visibility still within the industry. And so we were actually quite nicely able to connect all the dots on here. And so we were actually able to see it from the guest side as well. So from the guest side, once the attacker had actually logged into Booking.com, they then used the actual Booking.com system to then pass over a note to the customer saying that they needed to be paid. The payment had been made, and so again, took a URL, put it into there, and directed them to an actual fake site, which again, impersonated Booking.com. And it's a very good impersonation. It's literally using all of the same resources as the actual main site. And so on the dark web, these credentials that they were capturing through the info stealers, through the phishing, were actually going for as much as $2,000 each. And so it's not really stopping with Booking.com. This is the thing. You're starting to see that this is not opportunistic, okay? This scheme, these targeted attacks against the hotels are systematically being evolved. So we had the info stealer malware, which then changed into the Booking.com phishing, and now it's changing again. So at the moment, we're seeing the Agoda and the Expedia portals are now actually being targeted. So just in the last couple of days, there's been plenty of examples of Expedia now being targeted. And so the thing is that Booking.com, they've learned a lot of lessons as a result of this. There's still lots of improvements they could potentially make, but actually these other portals, potentially, they haven't actually been implementing those same kind of improvements into their own platforms. And so it's likely that we're just going to see exactly the same thing as what happened with Booking.com now happen with all the other types of portals that are being used by the hotels. So those are the ones I would say that people know the most of. Some of the interesting ones that we have, this is one which less people would have seen. So a lot of people nowadays are using some sort of monitoring within their environments. And one of the key things to do when you're an attacker is a thing called living on the land, okay? So you don't try to create a lot of noise by bringing your own malware and things like this. You try to do things in a way which is as covert as possible. And one of the ways to do this is to actually use legitimate applications. So we're seeing now reception staff who are receiving phone calls, they're receiving emails, and they're being told that they need to install some sort of software like TeamViewer, things like this, onto the machine. And ultimately, this again gives the ability for the attacker to then actually access that machine. And what they do is they come late at night. So out of hours, they will actually come back to these machines, they will connect, and then they'll just use the PMS system the same way as the reception staff do. And we've actually seen this in banks before, because it's went so far in the banks that actually the hackers were actually able to learn the way that people were using internal banking applications. They actually watched as credit limits were changed, and then they targeted the process, and then they reduced the credit limits again after they were able to extract money. And this is the same kind of thing that actually they're now starting to understand a lot more about hotels, a lot more about the processes, and so they're finding ever more interesting ways that they can actually obtain a data breach without even having to bring malware into the environment. And then I would say the last major one that's been quite recently is obviously the SafeLock vulnerability. So luckily, this hasn't really been exploited, but it just kind of shows another different issue that hotels are having to deal with. In this case, the key derivation function that was actually used in order to protect and identify cards can be impersonated, and thus allowing somebody to generate fake keys and then gain access to hotel rooms. And what this means is that hotels are presented with a lot of work in order to then go ahead and upgrade all these different systems. So the question is, what will hospitality face this next year? So it's unlikely that all of this stuff is going to stop overnight. And so we anticipate that there's going to be a strong evolution of this, again, over the next year. And so there are a couple of major things here which you're likely to see. So one is around the use of AI for impersonation. So we obviously saw that the emails, they're being crafted dynamically. So they no longer actually have to come up with their own reasons and justifications in phishing emails. They no longer have to keep them static. They can dynamically generate them. But actually, the AI tooling that's being brought into the market today is allowing anybody to essentially create fake videos, to create fake voices, and now to the point where actually OpenAI has had to pause their latest product offering, which actually, after I think you give it 30 seconds of somebody's voice, and it would be able to then dynamically generate any kind of words, any kind of sentences and speech that you need, just from entering the text prompt. So if you imagine that your staff could actually be impersonated, then suddenly what's going to happen is they're going to get called, and they're going to be leveraging the trust that exists between different people within the organization. And so that's going to be a really big issue, I think, that's going to need to be dealt with. And so then the second stage of that, the phishing emails around the Booking.com side were, like I said, they were kind of still a little bit simplistic, because what they were doing is they were sending an email, they were waiting for the response, and then they were actually then sending the main point of it, the actual targeted threat. And so in this case, you don't really need to do that, because actually these AI engines, just presenting an example here, you can literally type in what you want to obtain. So you say, for example, your job, Mr. AI agent, is to actually convince a user to open this executable. And so it provides you with the full narrative to do that. And then after that, you say the person emails this back. For example, they say, this doesn't look safe. Can you confirm who you are? And so you just feed this back into the AI, and the AI provides you with the next stage of the attack. And so what you can end up with is just unlimited, fully dynamic phishing, where based on the way that the person responds to the email from the hotel side, the attacker can automatically generate a response to convince them that this is legitimate. So in terms of recommendations as to how to protect against these types of threats, so one of the key recommendations would be to conduct what we call red team exercises. So a lot of people are doing penetration testing, and that's mainly because they've been told that they need to do penetration testing for things like PCI. But PCI and penetration tests on their own are a little bit, I would say, boring. Okay, they're not really actually showing you the wood for the trees. So they might say, for example, you've got weak SSL ciphers. They might say, for example, that you've got some ports which are open which shouldn't be open. Okay, you've got some unpatched software. So these are all the kind of things that you might find in a penetration testing report, but they don't really actually tell you where you should be focusing. They don't actually really tell you how your company would be broken into. And so with a red team exercise, the way that this works is it's just a higher level type of penetration testing, where what you do is you target the whole organization. You would send them, for example, emails. You would pretend to be, you would spoof your staff. You would call them up. That's called phishing. You would essentially go on site and see if you can gain physical access to behind the counters, into different rooms, into different areas of the hotel. You would try to attack their VPN. You would try to attack their cloud, try to attack their SaaS applications, and you look at what works, okay? So if you can actually, as part of a red team exercise, if the team can actually coerce an employee into opening a file, then it doesn't stop there. They then take that access that they've obtained, and they then look at what else could they do with that access. Could they, for example, move laterally within the network? Could they gain access to other systems? Could they log into other systems as this particular user? Could they elevate their privileges? And then if they could do all these things, could they conduct a ransomware attack? Could they, for example, steal data? And so a red team exercise will actually give you the full breakdown of how they got in, what they did, and what they were able to achieve. And then you can actually take that, and you can actually use that to first to get buy-in from management, because it shows you a far more cleaner picture of what actually an attack might look like in the future. But also it helps you identify what's the lowest hanging fruit where you should be focusing your budget on. Then managed detection and response is all around EDR. So EDR products, which are a more advanced version of an antivirus, essentially these gain telemetry. They monitor more about what's happening on devices. And so they will send the information off. That information will be correlated, and that information will be triaged by the MDR provider. And then you would have a 24/7 SOC who would actually then take action. Now, the MDR is a fantastic, actually, offering within the market. It's something which adds a huge amount of value. So MDR is typically the thing which will actually stop like a real, genuine malware attack. So you hope that your MDR would be the thing that would detect the info stealer, and you hope that it would be the thing that would actually detect a ransomware threat if it was on your network. So the MDR space is one of the, I would say, the biggest bang for the buck. It's actually something which works really well. Then, kind of coming back to the phishing side, one of the biggest problems I think at the moment that exists is that other than email protection, companies don't really seem to have any anti-phishing solutions in place. They have no way to identify a phishing attack if, say, the user's personal email is compromised, or they get phished through LinkedIn, or they get phished through any of the different portals that are out there. So I think one of the key areas that the hotels need to be focusing on is how to identify and how to stop phishing attacks, regardless of how they actually come into the organization. Then, over the last couple of years, one of the key ways that ransomware actors have actually gained access to people's environments has been the VPNs. So a lot of the devices, I call it perimeter devices because there are load balancers, for example. There's VPNs, there's firewalls. These are all the devices which companies have been told that they can trust, and they have put them onto their network perimeter. But unfortunately, if you look at even 1 week to the next, all of these systems are now being hacked. So for example, last week, it was Palo Alto. Now, Palo Alto firewalls are actually supposed to be approved by the US government, and so they are supposed to be incredibly secure. And just last week, on Friday, it was announced that actually there's a remote code execution vulnerability in the firewalls, which then allows a remote attacker to gain access to the internal network. And this is the same situation every single month. So a lot of people are actually experiencing ransomware, not because they've done something necessarily wrong, but because, unfortunately, they've been caught out by the very fast-moving attacks. A really good example, actually, of that is Citrix. So we came across a customer, not within hospitality, but actually we did instant response for a customer who had Citrix deployed. And unfortunately, they'd been hit by a zero-day exploit. So this is where there is no patch. Okay? So the vendor, Citrix, had not provided any sort of patch, and their system had been compromised. And the attacker had gained access to the network and gained access to this actual, the Citrix appliance. And then when the patch came out, it came out with nothing to check that the device had not already been compromised. So all you were doing is patching a box which had already been compromised. And so at this stage, the attackers were able to gain access to hundreds, if not thousands, of different networks. So one of the recommendations that I would strongly make is that people think about what their internet presence actually looks like. How many of these perimeter systems do you have? And how many do you really need? Are there ones which you could put behind in a different way? You could, for example, a good strategy is to give them back to the vendor, okay? So rather than running the stuff yourself, give them back to the vendor and take it as a SaaS offering. And in this way, they will actually patch and they will manage these things for you. And then finally, one of the other recommended strategies for this is that in order to stop phishing, you should probably take the passwords away from users so they don't actually know the passwords. Now, I know that a lot of people have been taking it up with Booking.com, but they would like to see Booking.com provide some sort of SAML integration so that you can use things like Okta Now, using something like an Okta or an identity and access management solution, like Microsoft Azure, these are really good solutions for actually taking passwords away from the end users so that you have a single solution that you can actually manage. But what would be really nice is obviously, as collectively as an industry, to put pressure on more of the vendors to actually be integrating into these different solutions. And then ultimately, a lot of these, there are new technologies that are now coming onto the market, like passkey, for example, which actually allow you to authenticate using your phone. And so you don't no longer actually need to remember a password. And if you don't have to remember a password, then ultimately there is a lot less, they can't be stolen. So really, that kind of surmises what we've seen over the last year. So as I mentioned, there has been a lot, and hospitality is probably I would say, in the worst state it's ever been in terms of the number of different targeted attacks that it's seeing. And generally speaking, that different hotel groups are in a better place than they've been in the past, but there's still an awfully large amount of gaps. And I think it's really important to kind of be thinking ahead and getting ahead of these different types of threats for this year upcoming, and looking at what you can do in order to safeguard your systems. Were there any questions?
Thank you. Frank Wagner, ACT International. Do you see a risk in these QR codes that we have everywhere, gracefully inviting us to scan them and basically to invite something into our phone? Because I thought if I replace that with a malicious one, nobody will notice.
Yeah, that's actually, interestingly, we actually, as a company, we carry out a lot of red team exercises. And one of the things which our staff also notice is how many of the QR codes that hotels have. For example, they will have them dotted around the hotel, saying to employees and to guests to scan things, and you can just literally just put your own one over the top, and then the person will come along and scan it. I didn't mention the QR phishing that actually happened last year. Last year was a diabolical year from a security perspective, but it wasn't hospitality specific. But one of the things that people started doing is actually sending QR codes in emails as part of phishing. And what this meant is that all the user was receiving and all the email protection was seeing is just a picture. And essentially then the employee would take out their phone, scan it on their phone, and the biggest problem with this is that most of the time these phones are unmanaged. So all of these things you've made in terms of investments into MDR, into log monitoring and things like this, they all go out the window entirely because the user has bypassed all of it by scanning the QR code. So I would say yes is the answer basically to that. QR codes, they are a nice kind of user experience, but again, the user training, I think a lot of us will agree that even if you tell users not to do things, then they will still do it, despite how much training they've received. And so again, it's important to think about how you can detect these things happening. You don't always have to stop them from happening, but you can actually detect these things. And then if you're detecting, as long as you close down the attack quickly, then often you can mitigate a lot of the damage that's caused. But by detecting, rather than necessarily preventing, then you're in a situation where your users are a lot happier, right? Because they have a lot more freedoms, kind of thing. So again, it's all part of a multi-pronged strategy. And interestingly, when it comes to a phishing attack, if we look at the whole path, if I take our stack, for example, we have email protection. So it comes in, goes through the email protection, we look at all the links in the emails, we look at the email content itself, it gets to the user's machine, the user then opens it up, and then the agent on their machine will then look at it. And then, for example, when they go to submit their password to a site, we'll then look at it from a network perspective and we'll say, why are you typing your password into an untrusted website? And so block that. But let's say it gets past all of that, then your log monitoring on the things like Office 365 and Azure should actually pick up these suspicious logins that are actually happening. So you've got lots and lots of different opportunities where you can detect these different types of threats. So you don't have to block everything, but it is really incredibly important to obviously be very responsive, because these things can happen and they happen at the worst possible times, usually out of hours, and you need somebody who's there who can then quickly jump on it and remove the access, for example.
I know there's some more questions, but we're running out of time. If you'd like to catch up with this gentleman, I'm sure he'll be able to answer your questions. So could you please join me in thanking our last speaker? Thanks.